This lecture highlights topics in Chapter 5, Physical Development in Infancy and Toddlerhood. One key topic is called fontanelles. Fontanelles are those soft spots in an infant's brain. The reason you need these soft spots is, if you remember from the last chapter, the cervix dilates to 10 centimeters. The head of an infant is larger than 10 centimeters. So the only way to get the head out is to have it basically fuse a little bit more narrow without crushing the skull. So these soft spots, because the skull isn't fully fused, allow it to pass through the cervix or the birth canal. You have what are called these soft spots, and there's not just one, there's several of them. And newborns who've been through natural childbirth have what they call a cone head. Newborns who've been born via cesarean section have these nice round heads. Children with natural childbirth, their head definitely rounds out. The soft spots are the reason you have to be very careful of a newborn's head. It's because the skull is not fully fused, so you have to be very careful of the brain underneath. If we peer a little bit further into the brain, what you'll find are 100 billion neurons or nerve cells. There's all kinds of neurons, nerve cells. We're just going to talk about a basic one so we can kind of understand how a brain develops and gets from this tube that we talked about a few chapters ago, the neural tube, to a fully developed brain. So there are approximately 100 billion nerve cells. No one knows exactly how many, but it's everybody's best guess estimate at this point. A synapse connects one nerve cell, this is a whole nerve cell, to the next nerve cell. They don't actually touch each other. So each neuron or each nerve cell can have several thousand connections with other neurons. Let's talk about the structures of a neuron just briefly. A dendrite are these branch-like structures. They are surrounding the soma or the cell body or the nucleus, which is the power source for the nerve cell. Then there's a long rod or wire called an axon, and at the end of the axon are these root-like structures called axon terminal buttons. Covering this axon or this wire structure is this yellow substance called myelin sheath. Myelin sheath is a fatty substance, and it really insulates the nerve cell. So you can't have just as you can't have two live wires touching each other, you can't have two neurons without this protection touching each other. The myelin is what protects the message, because the message starts from the dendrite, goes down the axon to the axon terminal buttons, and then releases a substance called a neurotransmitter, which crosses the synapse or the space between one nerve cell and another dendrite, and it's that message and those that has to be protected. So definitely the information gets from neuron A to neuron B. This myelin is actually very important. There's not a lot of myelin in a newborn. So you can almost see how nerve messages aren't protected, and that's why you see a lot of uncoordinated movements. It takes a while for the information to get from the brain to the hand and to other parts of the body. So it's this myelin that helps protect those messages, and the myelin develops from fat in a newborn and an infant's diet. There's a lot of fat, healthy fat, in breast milk, and there's a lot of healthy fat in infant formula. So right away you can see if a newborn is suffering from malnutrition, the brain is at risk. There are a lot of neurotransmitters. We're only going to talk about two, dopamine and serotonin. I'll talk a little bit about epinephrine, but dopamine and serotonin are the major ones. And these two neurotransmitters also are affected by all kinds of psychoactive drugs or psychopharmacology drugs, such as Ritalin, antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs. So let's talk a little bit about dopamine. Dopamine is a major neurotransmitter. In an adult who has too much dopamine, that person develops a disorder called schizophrenia, where they hear and see things that aren't there, or hallucinations. If an adult has too little dopamine, they develop a disorder called Parkinson's, where it's that shaking you see in some older people, such as Muhammad Ali has Parkinson's. So as you can see, dopamine with these two disorders has an influence in motor movement and in emotions. Serotonin is another major neurotransmitter. Serotonin, if you don't have enough serotonin as an adult, you develop a disorder called depression. And you can kind of tell what a neurotransmitter does according to disorders that develop from either too much of it or too little of it. So too little serotonin leads to depression, and symptoms of depression include problems with sleep, problems with eating or appetite, problems with mood, problems with concentration, problems with memory. So serotonin plays a role in a lot of issues. Epinephrine is a neurotransmitter that is also called adrenaline. The only reason we talk about epinephrine is because of those EpiPens, and people who have an allergic reaction, you have to make sure the swelling isn't too strong and they have that anaphylactic shock, so adrenaline helps them be able to breathe. This chart or diagram should have been split in two because there's too many things going on here. So imagine you're seeing this chart just as the yellow lines and then just as the curvy green, blue, and red lines. So let's talk about the yellow lines. The yellow lines illustrate myelination that we were talking about right here. So myelination of the brain really doesn't begin until really before birth. And you don't want the myelination of the brain to happen too quickly because then the brain would grow too big in utero. So most of the myelination, as you can see, this is birth right here, takes place after birth. A little bit before, but mostly after birth. The myelination that we're most interested in is this red and yellow line that's going across here. So here's birth, here's 1 year of age, and then here we're getting into the teens and later. So it looks like the myelination is decreasing. But really what's happening is that it takes so long for that myelination to develop, and then what you see is there's a bump in myelination in adolescence. And then really this is illustrating that pretty much the frontal lobe is fully myelinated or fully developed into the mid-20s. That's how long it takes for that frontal lobe to fully develop. And you can see the proof of it right here and how well those messages are protected in the frontal lobe through myelination. Now, these curvy lines represent another issue going on. So let's look at this red curvy line right here. This is called synaptic formation. So connections would be synaptic formations, connections between one neuron on the other neuron. And then not only do you have to form, but then you have to prune off the weak connections. So what you're trying to develop is a strong neural pathway. First, you got to connect a lot of synapses together, and then you have to find the strongest neural pathway. The pruning, even though it looks like something maybe you don't want, the pruning is absolutely essential, because as the brain prunes itself, it means it's finding the best pathway, the strongest pathway. For the brain, we've talked a little bit about this, but we'll keep reviewing it, especially if you don't really know brain development. Helps to review it regularly. So this is what we're interested in, mostly for child development, is the frontal lobe or the prefrontal cortex. We're going to consider both the same. This is where the executive function skills take place: impulse control, decision making, planning, organizing. And this is what takes so long, not only to connect, but then to develop solid pathways. The temporal lobe is purple. The temporal lobe, especially on the left side, is very good at processing and very efficient at processing language skills. The visual cortex is the green area that processes vision. The pink area is the parietal lobe. We can just call it the P lobe, the letter P, because parietal is hard for a lot of people to say and remember. But this is basically your map-making lobe, part of your brain, your kinesthetic movements, like where are you in space and time. Another way to think about it is this is your GPS, and it helps you navigate how to get from one point to another and where you are in relation to everybody else. There are two halves of the brain, the left and the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere is most efficient at processing spoken language. It's very linear in thought. It likes sequential information. The right hemisphere is more holistic, more intuitive, tends to be a little more creative. And people say, well, you're either left brain or you're right brain. It's a bit of a simplistic way to think about it, but people who are more left brain, their learning style is they like when they learn by reading words from, well, in the English language, it would be from left to right. If people are more right brain, they like looking at pictures. It helps them understand these ideas very quickly. Brain plasticity, we have talked about this topic, but it's definitely worth repeating. It's how the brain rewires and wires itself as a result of experience in the environment. The younger you are, the easier it is to wire up your brain. That's why it's important when children have issues to start intervention as early as possible. Sensitive periods in brain development. We've talked about this a little bit too, but it's definitely worth repeating. A sensitive period is when there's certain times in a person's life when it's easier to develop a skill than other times. One of the examples is language. If you want to learn a second language, it's easier to learn it before puberty rather than after puberty. You certainly can learn a second language after puberty. It's just much more difficult to become fluent. Let's skip down to this slide. This is how important brain development is and why children who are neglected or abused or suffer from malnutrition can actually shrink their brain or not allow their brain to grow. So this is extreme neglect. This of a 3-year-old. This is a normal 3-year-old brain that's developing healthy. So what's not developing is neurons are not connecting. The myelination is not forming. If you're interested in reactive attachment disorder, which is RAD, which are children who are subjected to abuse and neglect, this would be a really good topic. If we were in a regular semester, this would be a great topic to explore. We just don't have time to explore it in a 6-week session, but these are very powerful videos. Fortunately, this does have a happy ending. Sleep. Infants around the age of 6 months, this is a normal, healthy, average infant, around the age of 6 months should be able to start to sleep through the night. Their stomach is now large enough to contain enough nutrition to get them through the evening. Doesn't mean they like to sleep through the night, because now they're in the habit of waking up every few hours to get a bite to eat, but this is where they can start sleeping through the night. Co-sleeping, we're going to save that for when we come back. That's always an interesting topic. Breastfeeding versus bottle feeding. Colostrum is, if possible, women should breastfeed. Not possible for every woman, but this is the reason why it's called colostrum, even if it's just for a few days. It's great to breastfeed. The newborn gets a large dose of antibodies. Infants do not have natural antibodies for the first 6 months. Why it's difficult, you have to always be very careful about what diseases you bring around, colds, things like that, around newborns. Breast milk also helps the mother lose pregnancy weight. It's easily digestible for the infant. The infant has decreased ear infections, and they're less likely to develop colic. However, it's difficult to breastfeed and work. Even with pumping breast milk, it's difficult to breastfeed and work. We're going to skip down to failure to thrive. So children who are in certain environments, even if they have access to nutrition, some infants just tend not to grow. This is a problem. This is called failure to thrive. So Boston Medical Center has what they call the Center for Grow Clinic. And in this clinic, they have information and access and supplies for nutrition, books, psychological support, educational support, housing support. And it's all concentrated in one clinic. Children if 27% of the world's children suffer from malnutrition, you can tell that malnutrition, now you have an understanding of why it's so critical that infants have access to healthy food so they can grow a healthy brain. This is gross and fine motor skills in the first 2 years. What you should really focus on is at 6 months, they should be sitting up on their own, and at 1 year, they should be walking. The others, well, it's nice to know they're hitting their sub-milestones, but those are the 2 big milestones. If they don't hit those milestones, you want to know how close are they to hitting those milestones. At 9 months, they should develop this pincer grasp. Pincer grasp is when they are able to put their thumb and forefinger together to grab an object. The easiest way to develop a pincer grasp is to have them play with Cheerios, picking them up. Potty training in the US is between 2 and 3 years. Some cultures do it as young as a year. There is a movement, a very small percentage in the United States called a no diaper method. This no diaper method means that as soon as the newborn eats, they put the newborn on the potty, and this method says that they'll be potty trained by a year. I don't know anybody who's done that personally. Let's skip down to vision. At 6 months, they should develop what they call binocular vision, which is both eyes are now able to focus together, and they should have 20/20 eyesight at that point. Also around 6 months, they should not only develop binocular vision, or two eyes working together, but about the same time, because now you need binocular vision to understand depth and perceive depth. Now you have developed depth perception. So this is what's called a visual cliff. This is a checkerboard cloth on this side, and then they put plexiglass on this side. Infants who have no depth perception walk right across. Infants who have depth perception stop right at the edge, because they know then there's what they call a cliff or space. This is really important to crawling, so they're crawling at about 6 months, so hopefully they don't just crawl right off the edge of a step. And we can do the rest in your book. So that concludes highlights of chapter 5.